Well, hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in a second webinar. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that so many of our friends along the Eastern Seaboard have been dealing with some horrendous weather and conditions. And please know that we are thinking about you and you are in our thoughts and prayers. And we know that that has been catastrophic for the Carolinas. And so we wish that those problems are resolved quickly and easily. Today we're going to talk about a topic that I get a lot of requests for. Every time I take questions, every time I'm anywhere, folks will ask me about what do you do about these people who just are disengaged, the folks who don't respond, don't come to meetings, don't come to events, don't seem to have an understanding of what their children are doing in school, don't seem to have an understanding of expectations of their children in school. So today I'm going to try to shed a little light on this topic. Now, please understand that this is a very large, very deep topic, and we could spend hours getting into this issue and then looking at the resolution. So I'm going to try to be as concise as I can because I do want to leave time for questions. If history repeats itself today, this is one of those topics that generates a number of questions. So here's what we'll cover. We need to understand where disengagement starts. The point that I'd like to make to you first off is that people are not born disengaged. We tend to become disengaged over time and with expectations and with experiences and some issues in life in different organizations. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to do a very quick review of research. There's enough research on this topic to, again, fill a 3-hour graduate course. We're going to fly over the top of some things that I think are interesting and beneficial to our conversation today. I'm going to take you through a graphic representation of where disengagement begins and what happens as a result. There is a process to disengagement. There's a bit of a science to it, quite frankly. And we'll take a little bit of that, talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, how do you reverse these effects? How do you stop the wheel of disengagement and get the machine to roll the other way toward engagement? And that's something that we'll cover. And of course, we'll leave some time for questions. I want to start today by asking you to take a look at this quote. I'm going to give you a minute to read it. And I will say to you that it's not easy to read, quite frankly. I'm going to just give you a minute to read through that. This quote was part of an article that was written in the Kappan by Young-Ah Choi. She is a parent, also happens to be a professor, who had this experience and then decided to write about it. It was a little controversial when it came out because it says some difficult things, but I think it's important, especially if you look at that second paragraph. We tend to put parameters up on what engagement is, and that becomes part of the issue with families who become disengaged. So I share this with you as the kind of a beginning, something to think about as we go through the webinar today. This is something that when I'm in workshops, I share with educators who are in the workshops, usually primarily teachers and counselors and parent involvement staff. And it's an issue that, quite frankly, I hear as I travel all over the country. You know, we do all of these things repeatedly, And we never really get a response from many of our families. And so the question then becomes, what do you believe to be true about this issue? And it's not important for you to share that. It's important for you to reflect on that. Reflect why you think this is so. Why do you think that this kind of an issue occurs? Because what you think, as we will learn, will be instrumental toward understanding disengagement and also understanding how we can re-engage those families who have been traditionally disenfranchised from us. Here's a little bit of research, and I promise this will be very quick. The underlining in this first piece is mine. I added that underlining because it comes up again and again and again in numerous studies. And that is that many of the disengaged families in our schools believe that we don't really have a desire to engage them. And that's the beginning of building this successful resolution to the problem. How then, as educators, can we convince disengaged families that we truly do want to engage them? And if we are reluctant in engaging those families, perhaps we need to reflect on why that is. The last time we met in the webinar, for those of you who were here for the first webinar, I talked a lot about culture and beliefs and values. And here it is again in research. Now, this is 1992, but this research continues to be really as important and pertinent as it was when it was written. And that is that beliefs and values and perceptions drive a lot of disengagement and engagement. What we believe about a family, what we believe about their desire will dictate how we respond and how we behave. So that's something important to think about as well. This is a little bit longer. Teachers believe, and maybe rightfully so, that engaging families is going to take more time than they have, that they've already been really stretched very, very thin. And one of the points that I try to make when I work with schools and districts is to remind them that family engagement is not about doing more. I often say, I'm not dumb enough to come into a room full of educators and say, look, I've got a great idea, a great solution, and it's only going to take you 15 more hours a week. The minute I say that, most of the room will get up and walk out the door and find some other session to go to. So remember that family engagement is not about doing more. It's about looking at our present practice and perhaps doing that differently. That is part of the answer. And that's really what this kind of research gets to. There's also this perception thing again. We believe that certain families are unable to do this or are unwilling to do this. And we have proven, again, through research for over 60 years now, that most of that is really not the case. There's challenges in communication, differing styles between the school and the home, educationese. When we start using ESSA and IEPs and we start talking in acronyms, we know that that can be very confusing to anyone outside of our business, as it would be if we were walking into another venture and they began to use acronyms associated with theirs. Language, too, in terms of ethnicity and culture and languages of origin, is a challenge and a barrier. Transportation can be a barrier. We see in urban schools often that it's very difficult for families to get to school events or to be engaged with their children in the way that they want to. We also see the same issues, and it's not that is only an urban issue, because the same issue appears in rural schools in which families are living 40 and 50 miles away from the school are probably not coming to back to school night. So transportation, location, logistics, those kinds of things can be barriers as well. Time is always an issue. Everybody is out of time. Time is very, very precious. And one of the things I learned many years ago, I happened to be in a workshop listening to someone talk about time, and they said to us in the workshop, you know, human beings will make time for whatever they deem important and valuable to them. And I remember writing that down. And that stuck with me for a long, long time. It was years and years ago when I can't even remember who said it, but I remembered that phrase because time is an issue, but sometimes time is a barrier. Oh, I don't have time. Well, maybe you do if we reorganized and reprioritized and thought differently about the things that we do in school. The comfort level of teachers working directly with families and vice versa, the comfort level of families can be an issue. You know, I just wrote a blog that'll be coming out shortly about the fact that we still, even though there's been an increase, a vast number of our teacher preparation programs around the country don't even get into the topic of family engagement. And so we tend to thrust teachers in a position without giving them the kind of support, the kind of professional learning, and the kind of capacity building that they need. So their comfort level is not good, and rightfully so. And of course, the same with families, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is here in a few minutes. Fear, and we're going to get into this a little bit deeper in a few minutes, but fear actually happens to be the biggest barrier to family engagement and is most of the reason why people are disengaged with school or, quite frankly, with anything. And those fears come in shapes and sizes, all kinds of shapes and sizes. The perception that the environment of the school is unwelcoming. You know, that's speaks for itself. Also, tension and conflict, especially if there has been terse words between a family and a teacher, or there are a number of siblings, and there was a problem with a sibling 3 years ago with a particular teacher, and suddenly now a child from the same family is in the same classroom. There's automatic and immediate tension and immediate conflict. And then, of course, assumptions and attitudes, you know, what we believe and what we think is true. We're going to talk a little bit more about assumptions here in a minute. But our attitude toward engaging every family. Do we think we can? Do we think it's worth our time? Do we think it'll get us anything? Those are important questions that we have to ask ourselves as educators, because to get this to work, as I said early in the earlier webinar, this really is a culture change in our organization. And in order to get that done, we really have to examine, however difficult that may be, we have to examine what we think and what we believe and how that's driving our behavior. And then lastly, of course, many families come to us from other countries in which family engagement is not expected, and they are thrust into our organization that says, well, you know, we want you to be engaged, and they simply don't understand what that means or how to do it, so they don't. We'll go through a little faster here because I don't think that these things are foreign to the listeners and the viewers in the webinar today. These are research assumptions, summaries rather, from that perception research that we have talked about. Families disengaged, and when we say families, we're talking about the disengaged ones, the ones that are not connected to our schools. They believe there's no easy access or no desire on our part to engage them. They believe that teachers blame them when their children have issues in school. Whether that's fair or not, and whether that's correct or not, and whether that upsets us or not, those are important questions that we can discuss. But the fact of the matter is that research keeps telling us that these are issues that are preventing these kinds of families from engaging in the educational lives of their children. They believe that teachers only share negative information and absolutely wait for the tipping point, the boiling point of a problem to occur. And then switching over to teachers don't believe that families respect them or their ability or what they do. And that is borne out in many terse conversations. And anybody would get into a conversation where someone was speaking to us and being highly critical of how we did our job, who wouldn't come away from that thinking that there's a lack of respect on the part of families? Any decisions that families question, there is concern on the part of teachers and staff. Then this is true for leadership, and any kinds of decisions that are made in the school that are questioned by parents tend to start the root of disengagement. Some teachers believe that families actually encourage their children to be disrespectful, and I suppose that it's possible that that occurs. However, there's not any research that I've ever seen that says there is a widespread proof that is true. And lastly, teachers want more support from families for what they do in their classrooms. When survey after survey that nationally that has gone to teachers keeps saying, I love my students. I just wish I had a better relationship with their families, and I wish their families appreciated and supported more of what I did in my classroom. Well, today's the day that we're going to try to get you there, that we have to understand one very important point, and that is that both sides care. Teachers very much care about their students. I have never met a teacher who wanted to fail or who took delight in their students failing. Conversely, every parent, regardless of their station in life, wants their children to succeed. I think I've mentioned this before, one of my favorite books of all time, Raising Self-Reliant Children in a Self-Indulgent World, 1988. The author said that the one commonality of families all over the world is their desire for their children to exceed them in their quality of life. We can build upon that and look at how we can reattach and re-engage families who have been distant from us sometimes for years and years. So now I want to move to this cycle of disengagement. I've created a little graphic for you today that I hope helps explain this and get us through something that's relatively complicated a little more quickly, quite frankly, because we have a limited amount of time. Where does disengagement start? And does it ever end? Can you really engage someone who is disengaged from an organization or who has been disengaged for a period of time? And the answer to that question is, of course you can. But you need to understand where it starts and what happens. And it usually starts with some sort of issue or problem, something that can be very small. The example that I use in workshops all the time is, over the summertime, parents at the elementary level all get together and they decide who the best second grade teacher is. And then all of the teacher assignments come out. And obviously, not every person in the second grade can get that one teacher that's perceived to be wonderful. And suddenly the other parents are calling the school demanding that their child be placed in the class. Of course, the school can't do that. And suddenly, boom, that kind of a problem occurs. Experiences that families have had over time. I'm going to tell you one unfortunate true story. But what that does is it gets us to what we call a negative catalyst. And any one of these things it's almost like you're lighting a fuse, if you could think of it that way. There is a true story. It's old enough now where I don't think we were identifying any people. It's probably over 10 years. Well, I don't know, 10 years old maybe. Back when CD-ROMs were popular. So because CD-ROMs plays a point in the story. Students in a classroom middle school were given an assignment, and the assignment was a project, and it was a 4-week project, and it weighted 4 times, meaning whatever grade you got, 4 would be entered into the teacher's grade book. And so if that grade was 0, 4 zeros pretty much spells failure for that quarter or that semester. And the students were instructed to do all of this work on a CD-ROM back in the days when CD-ROMs were popular, and turn the CD-ROM in to the teacher. And so a student did just that. They did their presentation. They did whatever they were supposed to do. They turned in the CD-ROM. And the next day, the teacher called the student to her desk and said, I didn't get your project. And the student said, but I gave it to you yesterday. And the teacher said, well, I don't have it. If you gave it to me, I would have it. I'm sorry. But the rules are the rules, and I have to be fair to everybody else. So it's a 0. So the young lady goes home and she's hysterical over this. Her parents become upset. What do? They get in the car and all of them come back to the school to talk to somebody about this issue. They end up talking to the assistant principal. Assistant principal pulls them into a conference room. The parents are angry, no question about that. And it's possible that the parents didn't do a good job of perhaps controlling their anger. I don't know the details of the story, but I do know that at one point in the conversation, when the parents were explaining how they were convinced that their daughter had done it because they had seen it go into the backpack, the assistant principal said something to the effect of, one of the hardest things to understand as parents is sometimes our children don't do what they say they're going to do. And that, I think, did it for those parents. They left the meeting and they disenrolled their child from that school that afternoon. That's an extreme example, but it's that kind of an issue that starts this fuse, this what I call a negative catalyst. And so, of course, removing your student from a school is pretty dramatic, and most people don't do that. But what happens now is they go into a mode of self-preservation. It's the beginning of the us versus them argument, where the school is not listening to me, the school, whatever the issue is, I need to preserve myself and protect myself from whatever the school has done or whatever I perceive the school is trying to do to me or to my child. There's a lot of ways that we can preserve ourselves, and the easiest way to preserve yourself is to distance and isolate yourself from a problem. You've heard the term fight or flight. Now, I know that we have fighters in this world, but most disengaged families choose to just isolate themselves. And that's really where the disengagement starts. That's where you stop seeing them. They stop coming, they stop writing, they stop emailing, they don't come to the conference, they don't respond, they don't sign the weekly folder, they don't do the things that we want them to do because they've isolated themselves from this problem. But what's important to know at this point is that even though they've isolated themselves, they clearly understand that the problem still exists, and now they feel powerless to do anything about it. So what happens to any of us when we know there's an issue that's affecting us, yet we feel powerless to do anything about it? Well, what happens to a lot of us is that it starts to bring us stress. And that stress starts to add to the layers of disengagement. It starts to push the family farther and farther and farther away from the school. Both the school and the family have driven a stake in the ground now, and they are miles apart in terms of whatever the issues are. And over time, even though the issue goes away and the child moves on, that feeling and that separation stays. And that's where the disengagement really starts to nurture itself over a period of time. Stress leads to anxiety. I don't know that we have any principals listening to the webinar, but as an old principal, I can tell you I used to get this phone call a lot. Somebody would call my office and they would say, are you the principal? Yes, I am. And they'd say, well, I want to let you know that you've got a problem at your school. Okay. And the person would begin to tell me what the problem was. It could be a smorgasbord of issues that might come up. And they would be very thoughtful and articulate in telling me what that problem was. And I would take notes and I would listen intently. And at the end of the conversation, I would say something to the effect of, I don't know that I got your name, but if you can give me your name and your number, I will look into this and call you back. And the person on the other end of the phone says, well, I'm not going to give you my name, or I can't give you my name. And when somebody says that, you know what they're thinking. And if this were a workshop, you would all, I usually ask in a workshop, I can't tell you my name because if I do that, and instinctively, all of my workshop participants always say, take it out on my child. So this fear of retaliation is an example of the level of anxiety that disengaged families are feeling. They truly believe that we are spending time as educators figuring out ways to retaliate against children, which clearly isn't true. But it's part of this process. It's part of this thought process and what people go through. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, anxiety leads to fear. The fear of being able to be engaged with my child, the fear that my child won't be successful in school, the fear that the school I'll never be able to go to that school. I'll never be able to participate the way I want to. I'll never be able to have a role in my child's success. And what will that mean for the future of my child? All of these fears build up on the sides of families. The same fears build up on the sides of educators. You know, I've talked to hundreds of teachers, and I have to agree with them, quite frankly. You know, how many phone calls do you need to make to families where you're being yelled at when you decide that making that phone call is not your favorite thing to do? I get it. The answer to that, we'll talk about a little bit later, is that we rarely spend time in professional development helping teachers understand how to cope with parents who are concerned, how to work with parents who are angry, how to redirect conversations. We spend no time helping teachers do those things, yet they're critical to this process of re-engaging families. And lastly, does it continue? Yes, because fear just keeps the cycle going. The more fearful I am, the more I'm going to isolate myself and continue to worry about the outcomes, whether I'm on the school side or the family side. So that's a very, very quick, really quick run through of how disengagement starts and how it perpetuates itself. Give you an example. Here's the Jones family. In the last 30 days, the Jones family has been warned by 2 utility companies that if they didn't pay their bill, their services would be terminated. Mr. Jones has been informed he's being laid off from his second job. Mrs. Jones found work. The pay was less. The family's struggling. It appeared they wouldn't have enough money to pay their rent. And the Jones children arrive home from school and share with their parents that they needed money for a variety of school activities with which they wanted to engage. The Joneses, not wanting to disappoint their children, simply smiled and indicated they would work something out. Unfortunately, they had no idea what they were going to do. That's a catalyst. That's a negative catalyst. And the solution to this problem is to figure out a way not to engage. Because the last thing that we want to do, or will do, quite frankly, is admit to the school that we are in dire need. Not that families don't do that, and not that many of our schools work with that. Certainly, I've seen thousands of schools that have, clothing and supplies and a lot of assistance to families in their community. But families like the Joneses, who are not really used to this kind of issue, who suddenly find themselves in the issue, tend to disengage. This actually was a problem in the recession when some people who were in big jobs suddenly found themselves out on the street. It was a difficult time for schools back in this last 10 years or so. So how do we change it? So before we do that, I want to give you a little test, and we're gonna be able to give you a poll. I want to see what you think about this. In a second, a poll will come up on your screen, and I want you to tell me which of those 4 answers is correct. The percentage of families who are apathetic toward their children's education. Go ahead and vote. Pick your answer, and we'll all be able to see at some point the different answers that you pick. I'm going to give you about 10 or 15 seconds to do that. If you're having technical issues, please let the folks know and they'll try to help you out. About 5 more seconds. Give everybody a chance to think about it and log in their answer. All right, well, let's end our poll there, and then let's see the spread of answers that we got. Can we do that? So we have 11% think 10%, 15% think 7%, 62% think 1%, 13% think 19%. Well, here's your answer. The percentage of families in the United States who are apathetic toward their children's education is actually a little less than 1%, which means, and here's where the aha moment comes in. We have a significant number of families who are disengaged from our schools. I've heard of 50 or 60% in some cases, and maybe more, of disengagement, of families who are just not involved, not engaged, don't want to know anything, and you can't get them to anything, you can't communicate with them. But now we know that in 99% of those cases, it's not because they don't care. And if you don't remember anything else from this webinar, please remember that. Please remember that all of the reasons that we've gone through for disengagement, and we've talked a lot about those already today, 99% of the time, apathy is not one of those issues. So what do we do? Be careful of what we assume. Be careful that we don't assume that socioeconomically disadvantaged families can or can't do things. Be careful that we don't assume that families for whom English is not a first language can or can't do things. Be careful of our assumptions that because the experience that we had last month or last year is going to now apply itself to the situation that we have now. Assumptions are very, very dangerous when we're trying to change a culture toward engagement. If we continue to do things the way we've always done, and we continue to think the way we've always thought, our chances of success are significantly diminished. Disengaged families are going to want you to take an interest in them, and they're going to need a relationship. We need to rebuild trust. I think what happens in most of these cases is that the families have just lost faith and trust in our system. And what I want you to know is that if you're listening to this webinar, even though you're having these difficulties, it's probably not you. Families who are not responsive in a manner that would be most productive for their children are so, perhaps because of something that happened 5 or 6 years ago. I can remember a lady in the workshop telling me a terrible story about her daughter and an experience that she had in school, so much so that the lady started tearing up, almost crying. And I said to her instinctively, well, is your daughter okay? And she said, well, my daughter is 25 and married now. This issue was as real to this lady the day she told me as it was when it happened clearly many, many years ago. So build a relationship with disengaged families and do that one at a time. You can't wave a wand and engage all of the families that are disengaged. So look at those students who are struggling the most, or use your academic data to kind of target those families who you think would benefit first from a relationship with you. Not a relationship with the school, but a relationship with you as the teacher, or you as the counselor, or you as the principal, or you as the bus driver, or you as the cafeteria worker. There's a golden rule of engagement. You know, I hear all the time that schools want to do things, and they do things and nobody comes. Or they get all of the parents there of the kids who are doing just fine. And so how do we then create events that will interest disengaged families? Well, there's a whole efficacy model that we don't have time to talk about today, but one of the things is true, and that is what I call the golden rule of engagement, and that is before they'll come to you, you must go to them. Outreach, outreach, outreach. If you continue to invite them to things, they are going to continue not to come. I wrote one of the case studies in the book I wrote was about an experience that we had in one of the school districts we were working in which a group of teachers did everything they knew how to do in working with us, and were just dejected and disillusioned because after all of these efforts, they couldn't get the families to come. So I ended up talking to one of the parents who on the afternoon of the event said she was coming, yet that evening never showed up. And when I asked her, you know, the school did all these things, she was aware of that. Yeah, the school provided transportation and food and childcare and tutoring and everything, every need was met. Parent acknowledged all of that. And I said, and the school asked you today if you were, or that day, if you were coming, and you said yes. And she acknowledged that. So, well, can you tell me why you didn't come? And she said very matter-of-factly, without skipping a beat, she said, well, because I know what they really think of me over there. And that really struck me. It ended up being the title of a case study because part of this disengagement problem, a lot of this disengagement problem, is their perception of what we think, or not to make this confusing, but what they think we think. It's a big deal. It's really part of the bigger picture in disengagement. I've always encouraged schools to just start asking people who don't do things why they don't do them. And you might have to go knock on their door to do that, or get them on the telephone, or send them an email, or use any kind of a process. But to begin to do some action research in our schools to find out why this problem exists. And what you'll find in the schools that have done it is they start to see a pattern of responses from families, and those patterns fall along the lines of the things that we have talked about today. The practices and procedures that we have in our schools. As a matter of fact, we devote a great deal of time to this in a lot of our workshops, because so many of our procedures we have created because they're convenient to us and because they help run our buildings well. And what we've learned over time is that many of the procedures and practices, and unfortunately some of the policies that we have in place, are detrimental to engaging the disengaged, actually detrimental to engaging families, period. I'll give you an example of that. There are schools that I have been to who have a rule, and the rule is that if a parent wants to visit their child's classroom, they must give the school 24 hours notice. Now, I'm sure there's a good reason why you need 24 hours notice for a parent to visit a classroom. And I do understand that we need to have some guidelines in place so that parents are not disruptive in a classroom. But the message that was received by parents when they say, well, yes, you can come, but you can come tomorrow, or you can come Friday, is not a very positive one. So I often encourage schools to take a close look at procedures, policies, and practices they have, and look through the lens of a family, look through the lens of someone who's disengaged, to determine, are these things benefiting us in our quest to engage the disengaged. And then remember invisible engagement. So much of the time I hear schools and teachers and principals and all kinds of educators say, Steve, what we're going to do is we're going to try to get more people to come to fill in the blank. Math night, reading night, back to school night, financial aid night, this night, college night. I don't know. There's 1,000 different nights out there. And one of the things I remind folks is that, what research has taught us is that the best kind of engagement, or the engagement that connects most to improving student learning outcomes, doesn't happen in school, doesn't happen in meetings. It happens away from the school. So I refer to it as engagement that you don't see, but you see the results of. So that notion of invisible engagement becomes important when we are trying to re-engage the disengaged. We may never see a disengaged parent come to a PTA meeting or a math night, but it doesn't have to mean they're disengaged from their child's learning. And that's something that we need to consider and kind of put in the mix of our thinking about disengagement. Again, it's a big topic, and we're limited on the amount of time that we can discuss some of these things today, and I do want to leave time for questions. The reason that families are disengaged is not because they're from another country or that they're poor. They want what is best for their children, but as I have said earlier in this webinar, they either don't know how, or they don't believe that we welcome that engagement. Those are the two biggies. There are others, and I don't want to minimize this, but those are really the two big strands of issues that we face. A solution is to communicate your desire and the value that you place on working with families. You're going to have to get a little salesmanship with some of our disengaged families and convince them that you do care. And I often say in workshops, of all the mountains that we have to climb in education, and we've got a lot of them, it seems to me that the easiest mountain to tackle would be convincing people that we care about their children. Because my experience has been in thousands of schools around this country, I have never met an educator who didn't care about children, who didn't care, who didn't want all children to succeed. And it should be pretty easy for us to share that and convince folks who may not believe that at the present time that that very much is the truth. We can't wait for them to start this. We have to be the catalyst in the process for reattaching severed families, for re-engaging those that have been disengaged. I know, and I've recommended to schools that they use some of their professional development time, that they use teacher time, whatever time that they can use, they might be able to repurpose, would be very beneficial in allowing teachers to not do more, but within the time frame that they already have, begin to be that catalyst in the relationship. Many times, homework and signing the agenda seems to be everything, make sure you sign the agenda and make sure your child does the homework. Many of our disengaged families see that as compliance, and for reasons we've talked about before. And I would suggest that not be the sole vehicle for engaging families, that we want them to engage in the learning lives of their children as well. Communication needs to be two-way. We're very good in school at sending stuff home. And we've got to find mechanisms, and technology can be a great source of allowing us to truly engage with families by sharing with them what will be happening in school and inviting them to share with us what they learned from their children about that at home. Technology can be a very powerful vehicle to do that, but we need to make sure, technology or not, that we understand the importance of two-way communication. And lastly, understanding a rule that my mother taught me a long, long time ago. And that is, the right thing to do is always the hardest thing to do. And sometimes when we are faced with having to make a decision, having to do something that's going to help engagement, it's probably not going to be the easiest thing to do. And that's just the way it is. But it gets better with time, trust me. And the good thing is that once you start engaging families, word spreads. And suddenly then it becomes less cumbersome to re-engage disengaged families. Yep, there are difficult people. One of the lessons I try to leave with folks all the time is, remember that anger is always a mask for fear. Find the fear, and you can resolve the issue, resolve the fear, and reassure the families. And that will, and I could tell you story after story after story of where educators have taken that advice and persevered through some very difficult conversations. It's tough to be admonished by people. After 38 years in education, I've had a few difficult conversations with a few people yelling at me. It's not easy. But what I keep in the back of my mind is that, what are they scared of? What fear is driving this conversation? If I can find that, more often than not, I can usually solve the problem. Communicating, as I said earlier, not what happened in school. It's very difficult to engage with things that have already occurred, by the way, but what's going to be happening in school, and helping to change those questions. What did you do in school today? Nothing. Do you have any homework? No. Those are the greatest two questions and the two answers that are heard around the world. Can you provide a mechanism for helping parents to be engaged with their children at home? Well, tell me about the order of operations, or why don't you show me the draft that you're supposed to be turning into your teacher? Or why don't you teach me what you learned today in science? Many of our disengaged families don't know to do that, and we can be a tremendous catalyst in helping them do that. And of course, technology can also help us a great deal in giving families that information as well. I'm fighting the clock here. Just two more things. We often in education, in schools, we say we're having a meeting on Wednesday night and it's really important that you come. And we reinforce the idea over and over and over and over and over again. It's important, it's important, it's important, it's important. And then we have our disengaged families who don't come. And what we do next is very important. Most of the time we do nothing. We've spent weeks telling somebody that something is important, and when they don't participate, they don't really hear from us. And all we really have reinforced in their mind is that it really was never that important. So I always advise that when you expect families to do something and they don't do it, call them and don't judge them. Simply say, I am really sorry that you couldn't come, but I've got some really great information that I think is going to help you and your child. How can I get it to you? It's a little bit of a sales pitch, but it shows them, wow, I wonder how many families have gotten a phone call saying, we're sorry you couldn't come. And we still want to get you this information. We don't care why you didn't come. We're not going to judge you, but we still want you to have this information because we still value the partnership that we have with you. That's a powerful message that begins to change people's attitudes and perceptions. Don't give up. Winston Churchill, never, 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 never give up. Many of our disengaged families expect us to do just that. It's happened to them over and over and over. And so one of the pieces of advice I always give is, win small, win early, and win often. Don't try to eat the whole elephant. Target a family or two, get some successes, and figure out what you've learned and move on from there. And lastly, this does not happen overnight. We live in a world where we want instant gratification. We want strategies that we can employ tomorrow that's going to fix everything. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't have one. What I know is that it took a long time for people to become disengaged, and it's going to take a little bit of time to get them re-engaged. So that takes us through a very treetop flyover of disengaged families, why they're disengaged, and how we might be able to go about helping improve that disengagement. So I will turn it the screen back over to my friends at Livingtree, and we'll see if we have any questions. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. And that was awesome information. So thank you for sharing that with our attendees here. And so we're going to jump right into our Q&A section of the webinar. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, please select the Q&A box at the bottom and submit those there. Denise has been collecting your questions, and we're going to have Dr. Constantino answer a couple of those right now.
So thanks so much for attending today, everyone. And we did get quite a few questions. So we're going to start with the first question from Dana. And her question, Dr. Constantino, is we'd like you to talk about engagement from the baby boomers perspective versus the millennial perspective, and maybe how that ties in with the golden rule of engagement. If you're saying before they will come to you, you must go to them, how can the baby boomer perspective, and how the millennials perspective now ties into that, how they
Yeah, that's a great question. We know, and I happen to be on the tail end of the boomers, so I think I know something about this. We know from research, Pew Research, PEW is, I think, the national research house that does a lot of research on the technology uses of people between the ages of 18 and 35. And what we know to be true is that our millennial parents, our younger parents, are expecting information differently, are expecting that spend a great deal of time on technology, more so than boomers do. And it's hard for, I call myself a digital immigrant as opposed to younger people who are digital natives. I struggle with keeping a calendar. And I'm always amazed at people who can just come to my keyboard and go and fix it. That's the divide. And so I think one of the things that we want to embrace is the fact that technology is more than communication. The right technology will allow you to engage with families and engage with millennials that probably get most of their information off their phone. And so that's perfectly acceptable. And the question is, can you engage somebody with technology? Absolutely, you can. I think for people like me, who are a bit long in the tooth, it's difficult for us to cross that Rubicon, to understand that we have different needs in different families, that we have families who are older and families who are younger. So I think the more we spend professional time working and talking and thinking about family engagement, the more it will help everybody to understand it. I hope that answers at least part of that question.
Okay, thank you. Another one came in from Shane, and that question is, how do we get teachers to empathize or walk in the shoes of families who don't like school? Articles, books, simulations, etc.
Yeah, one of the things that I realized back in the days when I was a principal is that I could stand and talk to the faculty all day long about the conditions that our children came from. The day that I put them all on a bus and drove them to the neighborhood, and the day that I arranged for families to meet the teachers, and the day that I gave the teachers time to spend in the neighborhoods and some of the homes of the children we came from, was the day that their empathy completely changed. One of the lessons I learned in my life was I spent a long time in my career thinking I knew what poverty was. The first time I walked into an impoverished apartment, I was absolutely shocked and realized that what I thought I knew, I did not know. So understanding that regardless of someone's station in life, it has very little bearing as to whether or not they want their children to succeed. And it's hard for us not to be judgmental. It's hard for us not to walk into one of those situations and see the negative. What we need to do is look at those situations and find the positive.
Great. Okay, we have time for one more. So this one is from Linda, and it says, can you share some strategies for how to get parents honest input, especially from those who feel uncomfortable sharing?
Well, that's an issue. If they don't trust you, then the likelihood of them sharing what they truly believe is pretty slim. So one of the things that we have seen successful and interesting question, we don't see too much research on this particular topic, so maybe you've given me an idea to look into something. But one of the things we do is we find ambassadors and intermediaries where families will trust other families and tell them things that they won't tell us. And so when we engage, for example, in a family ambassador program, we simply use other families that are already connected to our school to help understand why families who are disengaged are so. That's one of the strategies that I've seen work over time. I don't know that surveys are very effective. I don't know that sending a sheet of paper home and having them write it down and send it back. There's so much paranoia in the world about, are you going to recognize my handwriting and all this crazy stuff? But I think if you can find families that are in a position where they feel comfortable. The other strategy I would suggest is to move school events into communities. There's no rule that says that the monthly PTA meeting has to be in the library or the cafeteria. Why couldn't it be in the basement of the local church, where more disengaged families might feel more comfortable in at least attending, perhaps not sharing everything that's on their heart the first time, but at least seeing that we're making an effort to meet them on their kind of neutral ground, because many disengaged families see school as a place they can't go to or they won't go to. So I've had meetings in church basements. I've had meetings in apartment complex meeting rooms. I've had meetings in laundromats. I've had meetings at Walmart. I've had meetings at Denny's. I will meet with folks wherever they feel comfortable going. And after time, they start to think, okay, he or she is pretty sincere about this, so let me share what I really think. So those are a couple of ideas.
Thank you. So I think that's all the time we have for questions today. Thanks so much for everyone's participation.
Thank you, everybody.
And Kellen, I think our next steps are we're going to send out the recording.
Yeah, so we'll be sending out the recording of this webinar within about 24 hours or so. So check your email that you registered with, and you'll have some of the details about the webinar as well as the recording of it there. And then if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Livingtree and what we do and some of the resources that we might have available for you, you can visit our website at www.livingtree.com. And thank you again for Dr. Constantino for being here and sharing your.
My pleasure. Thank you all very much. I know how busy you are. I appreciate you being with us.
Thank you. All right,
Thank you so much,
everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.